Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
Reddit. What is your creepiest, most unnerving story? Real or not, please creep us out. Pat 2. I was super excited to get my first apartment. It was in an old antebellum house that was split into 4 units. Very cool place to live. However, every time I was taking a shower, I would get this overwhelmingly creepy feeling. Like somebody was watching me. Then the dreams started. I kept dreaming about this old lady in a pink nightgown. Sometimes she just looked frail and sweet, and she'd say that I should go with her. She never said where we'd go. Other times, the dreams were terrifying. Her eye sockets were empty. Her hair was greasy, stringy, and falling out. Her mouth was twisted in a tormented scream. And she'd frantically claw the air trying to grab me. The longer I lived there, the more menacing the dreams got. Also, the feeling of unease and the feeling of being watched in the shower increased dramatically. By the time we moved out, I couldn't close my eyes in the shower. It sounds silly, but I had this overwhelming feeling that I was going to die or lose my soul or something if I had my eyes closed too long. After moving out, I discussed all these weird feelings with a friend of mine who had recently moved into a house across the street from the old apartment. I was trying to laugh it off. He said that another friend of his used to live in the apartment above mine several years ago. An old lady died in what used to be my apartment. Nobody else wanted to live in that unit for more than a couple of months at a time. The building recently burned down. The fire started in my old apartment. They still don't know what started the fire. Still creeps me out. It was 1933 and she was 13, living in the middle of Manchester, England. One night she got out of bed to go to the bathroom, and as she wandered through past the staircase, she saw her auntie standing at the top looking out the window. Curious, she trotted upstairs and stood next to see what she was looking at, but only saw the back garden and the alleyway out the back. She turned to ask her auntie what she was looking at only to see a nebulous, faceless figure staring back down at her. The figure then reached out her hands and gripped my young grandmother's face. The next thing my grandmother remembers is her older brother, about 27, running down the hall towards them, picking her up and carrying her into the nearest room. She then spent the next week in and out of consciousness, eventually recovering, but now without a sense of smell. Her family insist it was all a hallucination caused by a severe case of influenza, which is probably true, but my grandmother said she never felt safe in that house ever again. She moved to New Zealand about 10 years later and only ever returned to England, and that house, once before she died, was moving it. A distorted face appeared in the moonlight inches from my face. I barely screamed as my lungs seized up as I tripped backwards and hit my head on the slate floor. I woke up the next day in the emergency room with a mild concussion. Apparently my father had snuck into the house while my mom was away to grab a few things he had left, like his grandfather's revolver, which didn't work by the way. The part that creeps me out was that we never had any Halloween masks and my dad was never the type to pull pranks of any type. When I talked to him about it, he said he never went into the basement and that he found me on the floor bleeding like a stuck pig on the floor. He mentioned he was very glad he had came or I would have been in trouble. One school day, a boy named Tom was sitting in class and doing math. It was 6 more minutes until after school. As he was doing his homework, something caught his eye. His desk was next to the window, and he turned and looked to the grass outside. It looked like a picture. When school was over, he ran to the spot where he saw it. He ran fast so that no one else could grab it. He picked it up and smiled. It had a picture of the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. She had a dress with tights on and red shoes, and her hand was formed into a peace sign. She was so beautiful he wanted to meet her, so he ran all over the school and asked everyone if they knew her or have ever seen her before. But everyone he asked said no. He was devastated. When he was home, he asked his older sister if she knew the girl, but unfortunately she also said no. It was very late, so Tom walked up the stairs, placed the picture on his bedside table and went to sleep. In the middle of the night Tom was awakened by a tap on his window. It was like a nail tapping. He got scared. After the tapping he heard a giggle. He saw a shadow near his window, so he got out of his bed, walked toward his window, opened it up and followed the giggling. By the time he reached it, it was gone. The next day again he asked his neighbors if they knew her. Everybody said, sorry, no. When his mother came home he even asked her if she knew her. She said, no. He went to his room, placed the picture on his desk and fell asleep. Once again he was awakened by a tapping. He took the picture and followed the giggling. He walked across the road, when suddenly he got hit by a car. He was dead with the picture in his hand. The driver got out of the car and tried to help him, but it was too late. Suddenly he saw the picture and picked it up. He saw a cute girl holding up 3 fingers. Several months ago, my cat went missing in the woods, and I had to look for him. It was late at night, and the moon was a thin crescent, so the only source of light was my flashlight. I had seen my cat several times, but he seemed to be scared of something. Every time I got close, he'd run further away. At a certain point, he got scared of something, and ran back towards the house. I started to make my way back, and saw a man. He was just standing there, absolutely still. He had nondescript brown hair, and a tweed jacket on. I could make out all of his facial features except his eyes, where there just seemed to be shadow. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. I then said, I can see you, you know, and was greeted with silence. I turned, and walked a few steps, and turned around. He was a few feet closer. I turned, walked some more, and looked again. This time, he was partially hidden behind a tree. I didn't need any more warning. I booked it back to my house, where my cat desperately wanted to come in. I locked the doors, and sat on my couch until I calmed down. Ever since that night, every few weeks, I hear a noise at my window. A slow, loud, rhythmic tap. There's no trees out there, and most of the nights it's happened, there's no wind. Every time, I've been too scared to look. Probably for the better, the last thing I want to see is a man with a tweed jacket, and no eyes. So, my grandparents lived on a farm in the middle of Nebraska. They had just gotten married, moved in together, and had their first baby. The baby was only a few months old and needed to be watched, but it was early morning and the cows had to be milked. My grandfather couldn't have done the work alone, he needed my grandmother to help. The labor was easy and only took a short while to be finished, and the baby, my aunt, had been fed a while ago and was soundly sleeping. So my grandfather and grandmother both went to the barn to milk the cows, leaving my aunt asleep. They finish milking the cows and my grandmother heads back to the house while my grandfather stays in the barn to do work. But when she approaches the house, my grandmother notices the door is ajar and swinging gently in the wind. She figures it is probably nothing, but is nervous just the same. She calls for my grandfather, who reluctantly comes to soothe her nerves. They enter the house together and hear the sound of the toilet flush just ending. Strange, yes, but farmhouses in this area at this time had rather shoddy plumbing, so while they become more nervous, they remain calm. They then pick up their paces and head towards the cradle where my aunt has begun screaming. The light, hanging down from the ceiling, is swinging violently as if it was just thrown on. My grandmother goes to pick up my aunt, noticing a black hair on her white gown. Both of my grandparents had white blonde hair and there is no one around who could own this hair. My grandmother becomes hysterical when my grandfather notices the latch to the attic is swinging, as though someone has just crawled up inside of it. He goes toward it, readying himself to open it. My grandmother lunges at him and convinces him in between her sobs to leave instantly, jump in the truck, and drive to town. Reluctantly, he agrees. They never found out if anyone was in the house or not. However, a week later, Charlie Starkweather, not sure on the spelling, was found less than 30 miles away from their home. He was, I believe, the largest serial killer in America for a short time when these events transpired. There was a hunter in the woods, who, after a long day hunting, was in the middle of an immense forest. It was getting dark, and having lost his bearings, he decided to head in one direction until he was clear of the increasingly oppressive foliage. After what seemed like hours, he came across a cabin in a small clearing. Realizing how dark it had grown, he decided to see if he could stay there for the night. He approached, and found the door ajar. Nobody was inside. The hunter flopped down on the single bed, deciding to explain himself to the owner in the morning. As he looked around, he was surprised to see the walls adorned by many portraits, all painted in incredible detail. Without exception, they appeared to be staring down at him, their features twisted into looks of hatred. Staring back, he grew increasingly uncomfortable. Making a concerted effort to ignore the many hateful faces, he turned to face the wall, and exhausted, he fell into a restless sleep. Face down in an unfamiliar bed, he turned blinking in unexpected sunlight. Looking up, he discovered that the cabin had no portraits, only windows. This happened a couple of years ago. I was staying at my fiancée's place one night, and she has a 6-year-old son whose room was right next to hers. I got up at about 1 a.m. to go take a leak. On my way back, I hear her son crying in his room. He has this stuffed cat from Build-A-Bear that he adores. It was his first ever Build-A-Bear that he got when he was 2 or 3 years old. Its name is Carmel and it has one of the voice boxes that plays a meowing sound. So, I go into his room and ask him what's wrong, why is he crying? He said that one of the cats scratched Carmel as they were jumping off his bed and that he was hurt. I picked up his toy and look it over and see nothing. I ask him where Carmel got hurt, and he indicated to one of the toy's paws. I gave it a kiss and said that it's all better. He turned to me, tears in his eyes, and said that he wasn't, and that Carmel was dead. I asked him why he would say that, and he responded that Carmel wasn't talking. Thinking that he thought the voice box was somehow damaged, or something, and I activate it, and after it's done meowing, I told him that everything is fine, and that Carmel still talked. He looks up at me and in a matter-of-fact voice says that is the voice box, not Carmel's voice. This happened in northern Scandinavia in the late 80s, in a part of the country that is mostly covered in dense pine forest. On the highway between cities in this part of the country, you do come across the occasional villages and secluded houses, but there are stretches that seem to go on forever with only pine trees as far as you can see. A young girl, in her early 20s, was taking a motor coach home after being on a trip down south, presumably visiting friends or relatives. This happened just as winter was approaching, and it was freezing outside after nightfall. This girl lived in one of these really small communites that you pass along the highway, but during the bus trip she fell asleep and missed her stop. Looking at her watch, she realized that they'd passed it only recently, and that if she were to get off she would be able to walk back in approximately 3 hours. Either that, or get off in the next city where she didn't know anyone or had any place to stay. She explained all this to the bus driver, who pulled off at the next parking space and let her off. That was the last time anyone saw her. Almost 15 years later, long after the search for her has been given up, she is stumbled upon by a hiker. Her dead body was found tied to a tree, well over an hour's walk from the road into the dense, almost impassable forest. The autopsy showed no signs of physical violence of any kind. Someone had just left her there, alive. A young girl is left home alone with only her dog to protect her. When night approaches, she locks all the doors and tries to lock all the windows but one won't close. She decides to leave it unlocked and goes to bed. Her dog takes its customary place under her bed. In the deep of night she awakens to a dripping sound coming from the bathroom. The girl is too scared to go check, so she reaches her hand under the bed. She feels a reassuring lick from her dog and falls back to sleep. She reawakens to the dripping sound, reaches her hand down to the dog where she feels the reassuring lick and falls back to sleep. Once more she awakens to the dripping sound. She reaches her hand down and feels the lick of her dog. Now curious about the dripping sound, she gets up and slowly walks towards the bathroom, the dripping sound getting louder as she approaches. She reaches the bathroom and turns on the light. She is greeted by a horrific sight. Hanging from the shower nozzle is her dog with its throat slit open and its blood dripping into the bathtub. Something on the bathroom mirror catches her eye. She turns around. Written on the bathroom mirror in her dog's blood are the words, "Humans can lick too." This one always creeped me right the fuck out as a kid. During boarding school this was making the rounds. Every boarding school has some odd tradition or skill students must undertake before graduation. At my school it was knowing how to swim, and at my brother's it was ballroom dance classes. Anyway, this specific school had a very outdoorsy tradition, and before graduation students were required to spend a long weekend camping alone in the woods. A faculty member would drop the student off after classes on Thursday and pick them up after the weekend. Most students looked forward to the experience as a calm spell before graduation week, with all the family drama and stress of moving out of school, began. A girl is dropped off at the location and has a wonderful time all weekend. She writes in her journal. She takes tons of pictures. She sees lots of wildlife and relishes the calm away from other people. She is very rested by the time she returns to campus. 2 weeks later, after the insanity of graduating and moving out of school, she develops her pictures from the trip. As she flips through the photos she realizes that one whole roll of pictures were of her sleeping. During high school Mark was over at his friend's house. We'll just call him Steve because I don't know his name. They were hanging out in Steve's room after just hanging up a poster of Limp Bizkit's Significant Other album cover that Steve had just bought. Minutes later Steve's dad comes by and orders him to take the poster down immediately. When he asked his dad why, he says never mind why and to just listen to him and do it. Steve is pissed but listens to his dad and takes it down. Later Steve asked his dad why he told him to take down the poster. This is the story he told him. When I was young, your aunt, uncles and I had to all sleep on the floor in one room because we were very poor. One night someone walked into the room, bent over my head and asked me, "Give me your soul." I was so afraid I'd pretend to be asleep. This thing would ask me to give him my soul a few times then get up and walk out of the room. This happened every other night until I reached my early teens. One night after he was walking away I opened my eyes to see his face. What I saw was a thing with the body of a human. He wore a hood and underneath the hood was a face of a lizard. A few years before you were born we threw a Halloween party at our house with all of our family. We ran out of candy so I drove to the local market to pick some more up. On the way there I was listening to the radio and they said to call in with your scariest story. I pulled over to the side of the road, called them on a pay phone and told the story of this lizard man over the air. When I got back home I could hear someone crying. I went upstairs into the bedroom and saw my sister crying on the bed. I asked her what was wrong. She said, "I heard you on the radio." That happened to me too. When I was about 10 years old, we lived in an old rental house while the house my parents currently live in was being built. One night I couldn't sleep, so I lay awake in bed. I heard some rustling going on in the dining room, and I assumed one of my parents was up doing something. So, I rolled over on my side and looked at the wall, only to see the form of someone squatted down by my bed, their head on the same level as mine. This person cocked their head when I made eye contact, although I could see no eyes, and I just stared back in disbelief. Although there was some light coming through my windows, no light seemed to hit him. He stood out against the light reflecting off of the wall, yet I could see no discernible features, just a black mass of a human. I rolled over the other way, utterly terrified to scream for fear of what he'd do. Needless to say, I never went back to sleep that night, and only in the light of the morning did I roll back over. Whatever it was, it had left my room without a sound. I coolly asked my parents the next morning if they'd been awake because I thought I'd heard something, and they said they both had slept through the night. This is long but my favorite. I have an odd habit a friend recently picked up on, a habit I developed about a year ago. He noticed that when I enter a room, any room, and shut the door, I turn my face away from it and close my eyes until I hear the lock click. Only after the door is fully closed will I open them. He gave me a hard time about it until I told him where it started. I work for a water seal company in St. Paul. We produce sealant for exposed wood, decks, boats, that kind of thing. You hear about sealant being a dirty word in the Ashland-Iker Falls-Ironton area, but not all those companies were part of the infamous Ethler summer that wiped out the local economy in the 50s. I got sent to an industrial park outside of Iker Falls on business. I checked into this dismal hotel, the Hotel Umbra, that looked like the decor hadn't been changed since 1930. The lobby wallpaper had gone yellow from decades of cigarette smoke, and everything had a fine layer of dust, including the old man behind the front desk. I hoped that the room would be in better shape. Mine was on the 4th floor. Being an old place, the hotel had a rickety cable elevator, the kind with the double sets of doors, one of those flexing metal gates, and a solid outer pair of doors. I shut the gate and latched it, and pressed the tiny black button for my floor. Just as the outer elevator doors were about to close, I was startled by the face of a young woman rushing at the gap between them. She was too late, the doors shut, and after a moment the elevator ascended. I thought nothing of it, until I needed to take the elevator back down for one of my bags. I entered, pushed the button for the lobby, and pressed my tired back to the elevator wall opposite the doors. They had nearly completely shut when again I was surprised by a woman's face moving towards the gap, staring into the elevator through the gate, too late to place her hand in to stop the doors from closing. This time I sprang forward and held the door open button, and after a moment the doors lurched and slid open. I waited a moment. From the opening I could see partly down the hallway, no one in sight. Still holding the button down, I slid open the metal gate and craned my head into the hallway to look down the other direction. No one. No trace of the girl, no recently shut hotel room door, no footsteps, no jingle of keys. I released the button, but did not lean back against the wall. I stood directly in front of where the gap in the doors would be, in the center of the elevator. After a pause, the outer doors again began to slide shut, to move towards each other until the space between them was the width of a young girl's face. In that quarter second several fingertips appeared, followed immediately by her face again, rushing from around the corner, staring at me as the doors met. I had been watching the gap where I thought she might be, so I saw her. She was about 13 years old, and very plain, almost homely, with a pale complexion and neck-length dark brown hair that looked mussed or slightly dirty. I didn't have time to glance down at her visible shoulder, to see what she was wearing. From her behavior I wondered if she was a runaway or a homeless person who had gotten into the building. She had had a glassy, blank expression, tinged with a little desperation, some distant desire or need. A look that could easily be accompanied by the words, "Please help." The next time I passed the front desk, I asked the old man if he'd seen a young girl running through. "Heard the stories, then," he said between throat clearings, rocking gently in his seat. "Young Maddie has been here a long time. Takes a liking to gentlemen guests. Always been shy. Never says a word, not a word. Just curious." I told him I hadn't heard any stories, and that there had been a girl taking the stairs and standing in front of my elevator on every floor. "That's our Maddie," he said. "She likes you then. Sweet on you." She just wants to see, that's all, just to see. All she ever does. Curious little thing. Just wants to see. I stayed at the Hotel Umbra for 3 nights. It was a 4-night business trip. The last night I tried sleeping in my car. It didn't help. Let me tell you about young Maddie. You only catch glimpses of her, of a face with a resigned look of quiet desperation, dominated by a pair of wide, dark eyes. Locked doors, barricades, nothing made a difference. She gets inside. I never saw her longer than half a second. Every time I laid eyes on her she retreated instantly, only to appear again an hour or 2 later. An hour or 2 if I was lucky. Let me tell you about where I saw young Maddie. Every time I shut the door to my bathroom, in my hotel room, I saw her. If I watched as I shut it, at the last possible second I'd see the crescent of her face moving fast at the gap. I'd throw the door open to find nothing. Every time I closed the closet door I saw her. If I watched that gap, she'd suddenly be inside the closet, leaning her head to watch me just as it shut. It's as if she knew where to go, where to be, so that my eye would meet hers. But there was never an impact, never a moment when she'd make contact with the door or the wall. The first time I sat at that writing table I saw her. As I closed the large bottom drawer. She rushed at the gap from inside the drawer, her wide eyes pleading for something I could not give. I pulled the drawer from its rails and threw it to the floor. I did spend that last night in my car, but like I said, it did no good. Tossing and turning on that rental car seat, the back ratcheted as flat as I could get it. I'd have to open my eyes sometimes, and if there was a place for her to dart from my view when I opened them, she did. In the side view mirror, or peeking over the hood of my car, once upside down, at the top of the windshield, as if she was on the roof. I'm back in St. Paul again, and I've been back for a year. But Maddie hasn't stopped. If I keep my eyes open long enough, if I watch a place long enough, I'll eventually catch sight of movement, near the copier in my office, a pile of boxes in an alley, a column in a quiet parking lot, and my eye will get there just in time to see her eye retreating from view. There's never anything there when I go to look, so I've stopped looking. That's how I've had to change things since the Hotel Umbra. I've stopped looking. I keep my eyes shut when I close doors, when I shut drawers and cabinets, fridges, coolers, the trunk of my car. Not all spaces. Just ones that are big enough. At least, that used to work. I was getting ready for bed a few nights ago, standing in front of my bathroom mirror, door shut, cabinets shut. Watching myself floss. I opened up wide to get my molars. I swear I saw fingertips retreat down the back of my throat.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.